Czech novelist Franz Kafka, who died in virtual obscurity in 1924, is today one of the most esteemed of 20th century European authors. His person and life are in many respects as mysterious and enigmatic as his works. A shy, appealing figure, he nevertheless remains veiled in mystery. There was a depth to his spirit not even his closest friend ever touched. Franz Kafka was born in Prague in 1883 into a middle-class Jewish family, the eldest of 6 children. Educated by governesses, living in a household dominated by a successful merchant father, the boy lived an intensely lonely childhood. The father was a very strong, self-controlled person, not easily given to human emotion. His authoritarianism, many critics feel, greatly influenced the young man's attitudes toward society, its outward forms, structures, and manners. The mother was a gentle, warm, and loving person. From her, the boy inherited shyness, introversion, sensitivity. But the inability of either parent to comprehend the essential and unique character of their gifted son gave him feelings of inadequacy and guilt, which he harbored all his life. The family were devout Jews. The young Franz was scrupulous in synagogue observance and in the regulations of the law. But when he later became interested in the deeper theological implications of his faith, his father showed no interest whatsoever. Biographers make much not only of his relationship with his father, but his relationship with the religion of his father. Kafka's late work projects heroes who are in quest of faith, yet fail to find it. At the university, he decided to study law. A brilliant student, he became absorbed in the writings of Plato and developed a love for the works of Goethe and Flaubert. He also read deeply and widely in the religious literature of man, the Bible, the Upanishads, St. Francis, Luther, the Talmud. His classmates remember him as a witty young man, yet painfully shy, a student with a sober and passionate interest in ethical and moral questions. He took a civil service job with an insurance institute upon graduation, but the work bored him to the point of suicide. In the evenings, he wandered about the city of Prague, trying to find release for his loneliness and melancholy. He would find that release only in art. He described even his early writing as a form of prayer. In literature, he said, man became dazzled by the truth. Life's meaning, he felt, could be illumined in literature, the possibilities of human nature fully disclosed. His writing made him a solitary, yet his spirit craved society and adjusted life within the community. He felt himself torn by the need to work and write alone, yet this very solitude made him feel heartless. In 1912, at age 29, he completed his first long story, The Verdict. In this powerful tale, a young man rejected by his father throws himself into a river with a protest of love on his lips. At about the same time, Kafka wrote what many consider his finest short story, Metamorphosis, one of the most terrifying stories in all modern literature and one of the most difficult to understand. At its most obvious and Gothic level, Metamorphosis chronicles the incredible ordeal of a traveling salesman who has assumed the form and the life and the nature of a huge and repellent insect. Clearly, the salesman, Gregor Samsa, has suffered his fate as a consequence of some crime, but Kafka never discloses what the crime is. It is up to the imagination of the reader to supply the crime. The insect creature Gregor lies in a world of all-consuming guilt. alienated from family and society. Dozens of scholars have offered interpretation of this story. It is a picture of man himself alone in the universe, living out a sentence for a crime he cannot identify. It is Kafka's own story, the alienation he felt within his family. It is an attack on bourgeois society, and so on. But there is a strange, unexpected passage in this story that may perhaps be a clue to its most important meaning. It concerns the episode when Gregor's sister plays the violin and the creature is profoundly moved by the sound of the music. In this episode, Kafka may be speaking of the intense spiritual alienation of the artist, the man who worships beauty. His art constitutes an act of rebellion against society. His commitment to his work consumes his ordinary identity. He undergoes a metamorphosis that is as painful and shattering as Gregor's. The almost hypnotic power of metamorphosis comes from Kafka's uncanny ability to write in what would appear to be a realistic mode, while conveying subject matter and themes of incredible complexity and richness. Kafka represents a complete break with the romantic narrative tradition of German literature, using an unusually lucid prose style to blend the allegorical and the real, the symbolical and the ordinary. None of this was apparent in 1913 when he wrote Metamorphosis, nor indeed at the time of the publication of The Trial, The Castle, or any of his other work. He cared nothing for fame, and few European writers of his day even knew his name. Between the years 1912 and 1914, he engaged in a hopeless love affair which served only to awaken his fears of inadequacy at becoming a husband and father. Meantime, he worked on The Trial, one of his 3 finished novels. In the same period, he read intensively in Dostoevsky, Pascal, and especially Kierkegaard. More than ever, his quest as a writer reflected a profound and urgent need for religious affirmation. In The Trial, Kafka again deals with a theme of punishment and guilt, again in the most enigmatic and paradoxical terms, and again in a remarkably clear and lucid writing style. A bank clerk, Joseph K., is brought before a court of justice, a vague and shadowy body whose purpose is to make K realize his guilt. K, for his part, does not understand the crime. The Trial is not a psychological mystery story so much as a philosophical parable probing the questions of identity, guilt, conscience, atonement, what Albert Camus would call the predicament of human absurdity. The story unfolds like a strange dream. Once K is brought before his accusers, before the law, the court takes the position K must have been denounced for a crime, else he would never have been arrested. K protests his innocence, but in the protest there is the unmistakable cry of guilt. The servants of the court, the law, are similarly torn by guilt. They know the law continually contradicts itself, and it is their function to serve and explain its mysterious operations to others. In a brilliant scene, a figure called the chaplain, a Christian priest, meets K in a cathedral, and there explains to K that there is an inner law working within the law itself. According to the inner law, the court really wants nothing of K. He is permitted to come and go as he pleases. Yet K is aware that the law has arrested him, and for reasons he cannot fathom. At this point in the story, one wonders if the inner law of which Kafka speaks is not really human conscience. One also wonders if the law in the trial is not in reality only the projection of human guilt. Quite clearly, the freedom K is supposed to enjoy is completely negated by his overpowering guilt feelings. The fact that a Christian priest explains the inner law to Kay would seem to suggest that this is an anti-redemption parable that says man is free except for the demonic guilt which he has created out of his past and which he cannot help creating. The proceedings of the trial are complex in the extreme. Kay's lawyer, Huld, whose name means mysterious grace, is at once a spokesman for the law and a defender of Kay, a totally ambiguous character. Then there is the doorkeeper of the court, a mediator like the chaplain, who stands between man and the law. He has a menial job on surface, yet he has a certain power over the court. The doorkeeper seems to revere the law, yet he shows his contempt for it by accepting bribes. Kay has led a respectable life, yet he feels the need to confess his guilt in near hysterical fashion before the court. It is important to note that it is not the court that has forced the confession, but Kay himself. The story, for all its parable and symbol, proceeds with the swiftness of a Hitchcock thriller. In the final scene, Kay is executed. In the manner of his death, he manages to flout the law, which seems to expect him to kill himself in a ritualistic act of self-immolation. But Kafka adds a paradox even to the execution by referring to the shame that might survive Kay. Shame of his guilt? Shame of his knowledge of the inner law? We do not know. We are left with the feeling that we have entered a monstrous world, yet one that is hauntingly like the ordinary world of ordinary life. Some have called the trial a novel in search of justice. Some have called it a novel in search of grace. Many have pointed out the similarities between this book and Albert Camus' novel, The Stranger. Theologian Martin Buber said that the trial pictures the modern world itself as a district delivered to the authority of a slovenly bureaucracy without the possibility of appeal. A Pauline world, except that God is removed into darkness and there is no place for a mediator. The trial has also been given, and surely will support, social and political interpretations. The plight of Joseph Kay is not unlike that of the victims of George Orwell and Arthur Koestler. In this sense, Kay is an everyman who is crushed by the mindless workings of the modern superstate, which, far from satisfying his personal needs, only succeeds in making him neurotic and eventually driving him mad. In 1917, Kafka discovered he had tuberculosis. He left his post in the insurance office to try to recover his health. All the while he wrote and published, though his work was barely known outside the city of Prague. As his physical health deteriorated, Kafka's religious concerns deepened. His friend and biographer, Max Brod, compared his disputations with God to those of Job in the Old Testament. No one expressed his dilemma more poignantly than Kafka himself when he wrote in his diary, "Man cannot live without a permanent faith in something indestructible in himself, and yet this indestructible part may remain permanently concealed to him." Brod, who perhaps knew Kafka better than any other person, gives a definite theological interpretation to Kafka's late novel, The Castle, which many consider to be the artistic equal of the trial. In The Castle, a land surveyor, again named Kay, comes to a village to take up a surveyor's job. But the villagers are utterly indifferent to him and at times hostile. Brod says that Kay's predicament is exactly the same as the Jew in history, and that in this book, Kafka is dealing with the theme of the alienation of the Jew from the rest of the world. In order to settle in the village, K must get the permission of the castle which dominates it, but the castle is barred to K. In Broad's interpretation, the castle is the Word of God, the inheritance of Judaism. The village is the world, hostile to the Word of God and to the Jew who has announced it. There is no release for land surveyor K or for the Jew, since the Word, that is the castle, remains mysterious. His lot is one of wandering, utter loneliness, and abandonment. Kafka himself gave no hint as to how the castle or the trial or his other works, like America or In the Penal Colony, ought to be interpreted. And it is of the essence of his genius that his work will support multiple interpretations. For though not everyone is a Jew, everyone knows loneliness, alienation, despair, the state of emotional and spiritual exile. That explains the stabbing power of Kafka to anyone who would enter his strange and forbidding world. There is no one here who wholly understands me, Kafka wrote in his diary. To have one person with this understanding, that would be a foothold on every side. It would mean to have God. In 1923, in the last year of his life, Kafka found that one person, a young Jewish girl named Dora Demont. She loved him and nursed him through the final stages of his illness, and during these months he seemed to all who knew him not only gentle and kind, for he had always been those things, but happy as well. When he died at 40, he may even have known that another generation would have hailed him as one of the great figures of modern European letters. He was buried in Prague, where his grave today is almost a shrine. In the years since his death, a half-dozen critical camps have claimed Franz Kafka as special patron. Freudian, Marxist, Christian, Jewish, existentialist. Kafka has even been used politically as well, and on both sides of the Cold War. Perhaps it will take another generation to put him in a clearer light. His profoundly spiritual concerns remind one of Dostoevsky and the great Russians, of Pascal and Kierkegaard and the Christian mystics. On the technical level, he shows affinities with James Joyce. Both men look beyond the surfaces of modern life, and in doing that, they implicitly rebel against the naturalistic tradition in fiction. In this country, Nathaniel West, in such works as Miss Lonely Hearts and The Day of the Locust, is the brother of Franz Kafka, though his surface material, America and Hollywood, is very different. With each passing year, Franz Kafka's reputation grows larger, and the frail, doomed youth of Prague, who once wept for loneliness, has as large and devoted a community of friends as any writer of his age.